afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicole de Guzman. I'm the Executive Director of the Bastrop Museum and Visitor Center. We are located on Main Street in downtown Bastrop. So I've heard some of you have been to Bastrop, but you've never been downtown. Tomorrow is the perfect time to do that. At 10:30, we will be leading a guided tour through our permanent gallery. And you get in with free admission tomorrow at 10:30. But if you wait, I'm going to charge you $5. So please come at 10:30. We would love to see you there. And then out on the table out in the lobby, I've got some brochures that we printed up just for this special occasion. These are our medallions that are located on 150 along Chestnut. They are inset into the concrete, and it's a walking tour. With lots of information about the trail. It's an amazing set of medallions, and it's got a fold-out map so that you can find all of the medallions. I highly suggest that walking tour, especially if you're already doing the hike here at Bastrop State Park. You can handle it. Yeah. So thank you very much. We appreciate that you're here.
UT to step up to introduce our first speaker, Frank Villette. Bill.
Thank you, Stephen. Jesus Francisco de la Teja, or Frank as he is known to his many friends, is Regents Professor Emeritus and University Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Texas State University in San Marcos. He obtained his PhD in Latin American history from the University of Texas at Austin, and between 1985 and 1991, he worked in the Archives and Records Division of the Texas General Land Office. Frank has published extensively on Spanish, Mexican, and Republic-era Texas, including the award-winning book, San Antonio de Bayard, a community of New Spain's northern frontier, and most recently, Faces of Bayard, Writings on Early San Antonio in Texas. He served as book review editor for the Southwestern Historical Quarterly from 1997 to 2014, and is the managing editor of Catholic Southwest, a journal of history and culture, from 1991 to 2005. Don Francisco has served on the board of directors as president and as executive director of the Texas State Historical Association. He serves activities in history education, including being part of the content development team for the Bob Bullock Texas History Museum from 1998 to 2001. Is that you? Is that me? Is that you? Yeah, I've got a theory. I have a theory on this, okay? And that is when anybody's phone rings in a group of people and they always make a mad dash to stop it ringing, it's not because they're embarrassed that they've disturbed a crowd. It's they're embarrassed that everybody has heard their dorky ringtone. I shouldn't have said that. It takes away from Frank's presence. Anyway, Frank holds the distinction of being the first state historian of Texas, 2007 to 2009. He is a fellow of the Texas State Historical Association and the Texas Catholic Historic Society, and is a member by election of the Texas Institute of Letters and the Philosophical Society of Texas. He was a member of the Humanities Texas Board of Directors 2011 to 2016 and is currently serves as Scholar Director on the board of the Texas Historical Foundation. Frank has received many honors. In 2009, he was awarded the Captain Alonzo de Leon Medal for Merit in History from the Historical Geographical and Statistical Society of Nuevo Leon. He is an honorary member of the Sons of the Republic of Texas, an honorary admiral in the Texas Navy. I've always wanted to be one. Okay, good. And here's my favorite. In 2017, the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy named him a hero of San Jacinto. My hero, Frank de la Teja.
So I was given advice a long time ago that you should always be prepared to get up to the podium quickly before the applause dies down. Which is why I was standing right there. Because you never know how quickly the applause will die down. Thank you for being here this afternoon, and to Steve for inviting me to give this talk. And so I'm going to right now ask if you will all check your phones to make sure that your ringer is off, dorky or not, and that way we won't interrupt the proceedings. One of the reasons I retired was in order to avoid having to deal with students' phones going off in class, which was happening more and more often. So before I start on the Baron. Let me say that Bastrop State Park holds a very special place in my heart, and you'll have to ask my wife whether it's the same for her, but this is where we had our first real date.
Oh, yay!
And that was in 1982. And we married a year later in 1983, so if you do the math, you'll see that this is our 40th wedding anniversary coming up. And so I'm very happy to be here in between those two events, which have made of me a naturalized Texan for sure. Because I was not born in Texas. In fact, I wasn't even born in the country. I came to Texas to do my PhD work, which had nothing to do with Texas history, and I wound up working for James Michener as a research assistant, and that's how I became involved with Texas history, and here I am 40 years later doing Texas history. So Texas history has been very, very good to me, and I hope to continue doing it as long as I can stay above ground. And with that, and if you want the particulars of the story of our meeting, we can do that during a break or some other point. It's not lurid or salacious or anything like that. It's kind of cute, but it is special. Anyway, to me. So the Baron then. The Baron of Bastrop, or should I say, Felipe Enrique Neri, or Philip Hendrik Nering, was the prototype of the American adventurer who decades later would make his way to Texas, following the Camino Real westward in search of fortune and perhaps fame and power. Like those later adventurers, he was a wanted man. And I don't need, many of you know that many of our fearless leaders from the first generation of heroes were wanted men somewhere else. And not all of them for good reasons. The Dutch authorities wanted him for embezzlement of tax funds. Then there's the matter of his separation from his wife and children, which we will come to later. At least he hadn't killed anyone back in Europe, a couple of them. Anyway, although we can't be sure, right? We really don't know, but he wasn't wanted for murder. He was wanted for embezzlement. And from the descriptions that we do have of him from other people, he doesn't seem to have been the violent type. He's described as being rather genteel and formal and all around good egg. So in other words, he was a great con man. He made his way to Texas down the Camino Real in 1806, and in that process there was this transformation into the Baron of Bastrop. If anyone in San Antonio in the years preceding the Mexican War of Independence had any knowledge of Bastrop's less than stellar background, then they never made it public. To the good people of San Antonio, the multilingual and talented Dutchman was an upstanding and important subject of the Spanish crown, just as he would become an upstanding and important citizen of Mexican Texas. The one thing that eluded him throughout the last 20 years of his life, when he made his home in Texas, was fortune. When he died in Saltillo in 1827, while representing Texas as the state's Constitutional Congress, he may have been rich in esteem and respect of his fellow Texans, but he was sick and penniless. How Bastrop found his way to Texas has much to do with the way that the Western world was developing at the end of the 18th century. First, he was a product of a world system in which colonialism played a vital role. Born in the Dutch colony of Suriname, or Dutch Guiana, on the northern coast of South America in 1759, his parents brought him to the Netherlands while still a young boy. There he grew up in what must have been middle-class surroundings. At the end of his life, in his will, he mentioned that his father was a baron. Well, you know. But that's okay. We'll get there. There he grew up in what must have been middle-class surroundings as he later, and by the way, they died young. They died about 5 or 6 years after they got back to the Netherlands, so he was raised by other relatives. But he had certainly an education, and he was able to join a cavalry regiment in the Netherlands, which meant that he must have had the wherewithal, or the family must have had the wherewithal, because being a cavalryman at that period of time involved certain expenses, personal expenses beyond just boots and extras. You had to be able to take care of your horse, and which meant you usually had a squire, well, we would call a squire or an assistant helping the horse and all of that. So it wasn't. So he must have had access to a certain level of income that would allow him then to marry a woman who did have noble blood. So his wife did come from a minor nobility in the Netherlands. He also, by the early 1780s, by the early 1790s, he must have had some connections because he became a tax collector. And that's what's going to get him into trouble, right? A failure to live within his means probably led to his making some loans to himself, which he hadn't paid back by the time the authorities found out about it. Finding it difficult to explain himself, he did what many enterprising young men of intelligence and resourcefulness might do. He made himself scarce. Now, apparently, that's not the way he told the story. According to him, the version that early historians accepted as the explanation of the Dutchman's presence on the Spanish frontier was that he was a product of the French Revolution. Whether or not whether or not Bastrop felt threatened by the French in his far northern home in Leeuwarden. Now, this is in Friesland. So if you know anything about the Netherlands, this is the extreme northern end. You can't go any farther north in Netherlands than where he was at. And France is all the way at the other end. Okay, so picture that in your mind as he tells us, or as historians have felt, or at least early historians felt that it made sense for him to say that he was escaping the French Revolution because the French were invading his homeland. The French did not make it they did not overthrow the Dutch Republic and therefore take over all of the Netherlands until 1795, by which time he was in Louisiana. So if you start doing the math, certain things about what he's saying doesn't work. Anyway, the 1793 invasion of the Netherlands took place far to the south. It wasn't until 1795 that a second French invasion of the Netherlands led to the fall of the Dutch Republic, and by then, Bastrop and his family were gone. In 1795, we find him in Louisiana. Bastrop had completed, by this time he had completed the invention of the Baron persona. When he fled the law in Holland, he made his way to Hamburg, where he and his family caught a boat for America, traveling under the last name Bastrop. The family landed in Philadelphia in 1793, and 2 years later, Bastrop had managed to buy an estate in Maryland. Where did the money come from? Did he pay for the property from the embezzled funds? Whatever the case, it looks like Bastrop came across a business opportunity on the frontier that was too tempting to pass up. Leaving the family in Maryland, he journeyed to Louisiana, where he had arrived by April 1795. Did he plan to return after completing his business? Did he plan to move the family west when the time was right? Again, whatever the case, it appears that Bastrop's extended separation from his family led his wife Georgina to take the kids back to the Netherlands sometime between 1800 and 1803. Although there was no divorce. Okay? In his will, Bastrop named his wife and children. So there's some chance that somehow they stayed in touch. Just don't have a record of it. By then it was clear that the business venture that had brought Bastrop to Louisiana had failed, and that he had begun to look for greener pastures. And a bit about the venture. In the 1790s, Louisiana was a mess. When Spain had turned over the territory to Spain back in 1763, so it wouldn't fall into the hands of the British, most of it was still Indian country. Along the Mississippi and near the Gulf of Mexico, it bordered British territory that after 1783 came into possession of the United States. Spanish officials in Louisiana, many of them Frenchmen, who had switched brands of bourbon. Bad pun, but there you go. See, the French king was a bourbon and the Spanish king was a wine. All right. By the way, scrambled to make the former French colony part of the Spanish monarchy. By the way, the French Quarter of New Orleans is really almost completely of Spanish vintage. A couple of fires in the 1790s having destroyed much of the French town. Anyway, Governor Baron de Carondelet, you see why Bastrop might have thought it advantageous to call himself a baron. You're going to be dealing with these Spanish officials. Some of them are being previous French officials, now they're Spanish officials. And they are nobles in one way or another. So, hell, I'll call myself a baron too. Was hoping to start filling in the Carondelet was hoping to start filling in the area of the Wichita Valley with subjects loyal to Spain in order to deflect American interest. Without going into all the details, Carondelet and Bastrop reached an agreement in June 1796 in which Bastrop would furnish European families to farm wheat in the region. And he would get a monopoly on supplying flour to the province and possibly exporting it to other parts of the empire. The interesting thing here is that he specifically talked about limiting the amount of land to be distributed to the settlers so that they did not develop indigo plantations, which would have required slave labor. Does this indicate that Bastrop was not a fan of field slavery? And I say field slavery because during these years there's evidence that he had enslaved domestic servants. All right? So, but there is a big difference between field slavery and domestic slavery, although slavery is slavery. It's just that they're different. If that was the case, the practical needs of Austin's colony 3 decades later would bring about a change of heart. We don't know. We know that Bastrop supported efforts to keep slavery going in Texas, and he did so during his presence in the state constitutional Congress. So he either had a change of heart or saw things from a very practical perspective of this is what's got to happen. Same kind of argument that's made about Austin, right? Austin really wasn't a fan of slavery, but he saw the writing on the wall. It was going to be cotton country, and so slavery was going to be required. And slavery too, and Austin too had domestic slaves himself. So it's again, slavery pokes its ugly head in all kinds of ways in the broad cross section of society. But that's another talk for another day. As for the colonization project, by 1797, Bastrop had recruited about 100 settlers between families and singlemen and brought them to the valley. He requested and received permission to set up mills and had one operating by 1799. However, because Bastrop's agreement called for the government to put the bill for the immigrants that Bastrop recruited, and the government was about as poor as a church mouse, the province's financial officer objected to it. That objection probably gave the new governor, the Spaniard Manuel Galloso, we're switching from a former former Frenchman to now a full Spaniard, the excuse he might have needed to shut down an operation that he suspected was allowing Americans and, worse, Protestants into Spanish territory. The contract was soon suspended. Bastrop still had the milling rights, but the few families that he had managed to settle weren't going to do the trick. They weren't going to produce enough wheat to make the mill a going concern. So we can say that the Baron's impresario days came to an end, not because of his own failings, but because an overextended Spain could not keep up its part of the bargain. One last thing about Bastrop's days in Louisiana. He certainly got to know some people who would pop up in Texas, in the Texas part of the story. Among these was possibly Moses Austin, whose son Stephen said that Moses had met Bastrop in a tavern in New Orleans. A more important businessman he met while looking around for opportunities along the U.S.-Spanish frontier was John Nancarrow, who proposed setting up a sailcloth factory in Lexington. For his part, and by the way, sailcloth is a precursor to denim. It was used to make heavy work pants at that period of time before denim came along. For his part of the investment, Bastrop put up the proceeds from the suspended colonization contract, something that would later be subject to considerable limitation. Which, by the way, is something that also happens in the impresario period. They're trading these impresario contracts in a way that's totally illegal. The Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company, which brought together 3 contracts, the Valen and Zavala and Burnett contracts, and they were selling paper scrip for the land in New York City, totally against the colonization law and the provisions of the contracts. But anyway, so these guys are all learning from each other, and just like good comment, they learn from each other how to do whatever it is they do. Bastrop put up the proceeds from the suspended colonization contract, something that would later be subject to considerable litigation, and which made Aaron Burr, of all people, right? Aaron Burr owner of part of it for a time. So you can see that this stuff is, I mean, it's just amazing once you get into it. It's easy to get lost in the sauce, which is probably why most students are bored with history. Because once you start putting all these connections together and you see how complex it is, people's eyes just kind of glaze over. Just like I'm seeing out there right now. Well, the litigation over the land grant, which wasn't a grant at all, forced Bastrop and Nancarrow into bankruptcy. And by 1801, Bastrop was back in Louisiana, where the new governor, the Marqués de Casacalvo, gave Bastrop an Indian trading privileges for the Ouachita Valley. Some of the proceeds from the Indian trading monopoly he got went into opening the mill that he had built back in 1799. But it burned down, and he had to rebuild it. Just in time for the Louisiana Purchase to bring an end to his Indian trading privileges. Under the Spanish, you could have a monopoly. Under the U.S., not so much. Now, we're certainly not going to accept a Spanish monopoly. If we're going to give a monopoly, it's going to be to an American. So he's out of business there. And you guessed it, he was penniless again. He put his affairs in order, made out deeds to some of the families he had brought to the Wichita Valley 5 years earlier, and set out for Texas. We all know that in 1803 marks probably the most important date in American history between 1776 and 1861. Napoleon's repossession of Louisiana, which France had transferred to Spain back in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, and then his sale of the territory to the United States, not only doubled the size of the United States, but it brought the country directly in touch with New Spain, Spain's wealthiest possession. And it brought Texas to the attention of Americans in a way that had not happened before. Bastrop, whose colonization project in Spanish Louisiana proved a failure, apparently didn't care to repeat the experiment under American aegis. And we can speculate on any number of reasons why. In any case, with experience in how Spaniards ran things, with his family returned to Europe, and the estate in Maryland probably lost, I can't say what may have happened to it, and with local officials' acceptance of his title, the now Baron of Bastrop may well have felt that Texas was the best place to make a new start. The Americans wouldn't have given a hoot if he called himself a baron or not, but it made a difference in the Spanish world. Okay? Finally, we have the Baron de Bastrop on the Camino Real. He was not the only one on the road, for the Spanish government had offered Spanish subjects of Louisiana who wished to avoid U.S. sovereignty, and there were people who wanted to avoid U.S. sovereignty, an opportunity to settle in Texas. When he arrived in San Antonio in September 1805, he had a letter from Casacalvo attesting to his merits and loyalty to the crown. Unsurprisingly, he also had grand plans. He wanted to bring some of the families from the Wichita settlement to Texas, along with a group of Choctaw Indians who would help defend the new settlement against, among others, American interlopers. Bastrop was apparently banking on the well-founded fears of land-hungry Protestant Anglo-Americans to sell his project. His plan also fit Governor Cordero's own plans to establish a couple of settlements along the Camino Real at the Trinity, what became Santísima Trinidad de Salcedo, and the Brazos River, which didn't make it to the Brazos, only got as far as the San Marcos, right? San Marcos de Negro. It didn't matter. Somehow the Americans were treating the Indians and the settlers well enough that they didn't want to leave Louisiana. And the government had decided not to grant him Indian trading privileges, since it would have meant allowing him to export 500 horses per year to Louisiana. The government had repeatedly refused to authorize trade between Texas and Louisiana. Contraband was already rampant, so opening up legal trade would just make it that much easier for the U.S. to get its claws into Texas. Once again, the victim of government actions, Bastrop had to turn to other opportunities. There was a grant of lands on the Guadalupe, or as you guys like to say, Guadalupe, above the Camino Real, that he intended for a mill. He's still on that kick. He's going to build these flour mills. He's interested not in characters who claim to be faithful subjects, but were only interested in helping themselves. Not one of those admitted so far, which meant Bastrop, among others, had done anything worthwhile. Over all of them come suspicions of contraband activity, something that Bastrop may well have been participating in, given his freighting business and the fact that none of his plans had come through. So where was he? How was he making a living? And of course, that's the problem with contraband, right? It's like the drug lords. They're building this wonderful house, but where did they get the money for it? And so you know that something shady is going on. Such suspicions may well represent the reasons why, despite repeated efforts, Bastrop never gained a patent of citizenship from the Spanish government. Not that he didn't try to prove his loyalty. One opportunity came during the Hidalgo revolt in the opening period of the Mexican War of Independence. Not surprisingly, he became involved with a counterinsurgency group in Monclova, having gone down the Camino Real into Coahuila around the time that the revolt began. Acting as double agents, he and Sebastián Rodríguez pretended to be partisans and offered to serve as guides through Texas for Miguel Hidalgo, Ignacio Allende, and other leaders of the insurrection who were attempting to make their way to the United States. Bastrop and Rodriguez kept the loyalist Monclova junta informed of the movements and intentions of the rebels and rode in their caravan to the wells of Bajan, where Hidalgo and the other leaders were captured by Ignacio Elizondo on March 21, 1811. For their efforts in leading Hidalgo and the rebel leadership into a trap, Bastrop and Rodriguez got medals. Escudos de honor. Bastrop was not happy. He complained about being treated like a foreigner, but it did no good. He was not only denied citizenship at one point, he was disapproved for service as a municipal officer in San Antonio. That's gonna change. But he was persistent, if nothing else, and wormed his way into San Antonio society. Although because he was married, he couldn't do what foreigners and outsiders typically did when they arrived in a place like this, marry one of the local girls, right? And that way you marry into the higher stratas of society. Well, he can't, he's married. But he managed to get selected as second alcalde in 1818, during which time he certified the affidavits that the townspeople were asked to fill out regarding property lost to the Norteamericanos during the Gutierrez Magui expedition. That's a whole other very interesting story. So just let me say that while a large number of Tejanos participated in the expedition and were against the Royalists and fought against them, by 1818, and they were all saying that, no, this was an invasion from the United States, that the Americans did all this. So they accept no responsibility. So he did that. He provided corn for troops stationed in San Antonio. He even served on the committee that organized the Guadalupe Feast in 1815. The Guadalupe Feast was the annual festival around the feast day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, December 12th. He represented the interests of various individuals he had become acquainted with back in Louisiana. He served as an interpreter for the Americans who continued to arrive in Texas to the frustration of royal officials. You get some idea of movement on the Camino Real from a couple of these individuals for whom Bastrop interpreted. In December of 1820, Jacob Kirkham a plantation owner from Louisiana, had come to San Antonio in search of 4 runaway slaves, while Jacob Forsyth, a self-described farmer, had come seeking permission to settle in Texas. And so he became the go-to guy in matters having to deal with foreigners. Enter Moses Austin. The same traffic that brought Kirkham and Forsyth and probably a number of other Americans down the Camino Real to San Antonio also brought a Connecticut, Virginia, Missouri entrepreneur seeking the same type of deal with the Spanish government that Bastrop had attempted to make less than a decade earlier. Had they met in a tavern while both were in Spanish New Orleans some 20 years later? That's what Stephen F. Austin says. He says they knew each other from New Orleans back in the Spanish days. If not, it made no difference. There's plenty of evidence that Bastrop made friends quickly, especially if he saw a commercial opportunity in the relationship. In other words, he's a con man. He's a nice con man. Nothing against him. Okay, that's it. He forwarded, Bastrop stepped in to endorse Austin's project to a skeptical Governor Martinez, who forwarded the matter to the Commandant General, the infamous Joaquin Arredondo of Battle of Medina fame. It may have come as some surprise to Martinez, and maybe even Bastrop, when a few weeks later, the response arrived from Arredondo, approving the project. Arredondo was not Salcedo, obviously. Right? The previous Commandant General had been, we don't want any Americans here under any circumstance. Arredondo said, sure, come on. Let's see if we can't build a better mousetrap. When Stephen F. Austin arrived in San Antonio in July 1821 to pick up where his father had left off, Bastrop was there to engage the young impresario. He wasted no time in trying to turn Austin into a business associate, proposing that they partner on an Indian trading venture. Again, Indian trading venture and wheat, which, of course, did not work out. But the field had been plowed, and when Austin was ready to start developing his colony, he recommended and was happy that Bastrop was appointed the government's commissioner to issue titles. That was in July of 1823. By this time, the impresario and the entrepreneur probably saw each other as joined at the hip. Bastrop had the confidence of San Antonio's elite and about as good a working knowledge about how to message projects to the authorities. And Austin appeared to be very capable of bringing settlers to Texas. They complemented each other. While Erasmo Seguin was in Mexico City as Texas's deputy to the Congress that wrote the Constitution of 1824, he corresponded with Bastrop and Austin as if they were one. Bastrop never wanted to put all his eggs in one basket, however, also wrangled other opportunities from the new government. For in September 1821, Mexico had finally gained its independence from Spain. Although for a while, all the officials who had served the Spanish monarch had become servants of the Mexican nation. So again, that sovereignty, I can do the job. I'm happy to work for you, work for them. They seem to like me, you'll like me too. In this atmosphere, Bastrop talked his way into appointments as interpreter for foreigners, tax collector for a special contribution requested by the new government, and commissioner to investigate robberies by Indians in the new settlements on the Colorado and Brazos. Most importantly, he managed to get himself elected to the provincial deputation, the governing body based in San Antonio, to run affairs until a final form of government was devised. Up and down the Camino Real he went over the next couple of years to help organize Austin Colony and issuing land titles to new settlers there. By mid-1824, it probably looked to Bastrop that his ship had finally come in. Along came a new opportunity. Along came a new opportunity to travel down the Camino Real. This time to Saltillo, as Texas deputy to the new state constitutional Congress. The state of Coahuila in Texas the largest and poorest state in the new federation, was created by the National Congress in May 1824. Given its small population, Texas was awarded 1 deputy. Bastrop probably won the election as much on the false notion that he would have the wherewithal to cover his expenses as it had to do with his knowledge of conditions both in San Antonio and in the Austin colony. Bastrop went down the Camino Real one last time in fall 1824. Arriving in Saltillo in October, he carried the hopes and wishes of both the small and resilient, though destitute, Tejano population and the new Anglo-American settlers. And indeed, he appears to have been diligent in his efforts. He helped set up the office of Jefe Político, or Chief Administrator for the Department of Texas. He helped draft the state colonization law. He was tasked with appearing before the diocesan officials regarding the need for priests in Texas, given his knowledge of the people and settlements of the province. He worked on opening a port at Galveston. He carried Austin's request for an extension and expansion of his colonization contract. In other words, the Dutch pseudo-noble was the voice of Texas in Congress. But again, he did not put all his eggs in one basket. While he was in Saltillo, he conducted some business of his own, including serving as attorney for Arthur Wavell, who was attempting to secure a colonization contract from the state. It didn't do him any good, as did his efforts to have Austin and the colonists cover his expenses. Ironically, having found the one business opportunity that stood to secure his future, he died before he could cash in. When he passed away on February 23, 1827, all he owned was on paper: IOUs, land certificates, contracts. He left no funds to cover the funeral, which his colleagues in Congress had to raise among themselves. The Baron de Bastrop, as he referred to himself even in his will, never made it up the Camino Real again. But those last 20 years of his life, during which he traveled the Royal Road, made him one of the seminal figures of the formative period in modern Texas history. Thank you. Okay, I've got a couple of minutes, so I can not answer your questions. Yes, sir.
There's a Bastrop, Louisiana, far northeast
Right.
Louisiana. What's the connection
It's
to
named for him.
there?
It's named for him. Yeah, they're fond of him in Louisiana as well, to a degree. And a number of articles actually have appeared in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly, I think that's the name of the journal, on Bastrop and his activities and that early effort to establish. It was such a convoluted, like all con jobs, it just requires so many lies that he was sued, and of course those records are available so that people can find. He was sued a number of, and how do you get Aaron Burr, it's just craziness. And these schemers, I call them, maybe con man is a way of getting a laugh, and maybe it isn't, but they're schemers. They are the Elon Musks of the early 19th century. They have these grandiose plans, and some of them work out, and some of them are the boring company. So you have. And there's any number of these individuals. He's not alone. He's an early one, but he's not alone. So we can go even a little earlier in Texas. And by the way, one of the things I learned from a professor a long time ago is the longer your answer to a question, the fewer questions get asked. But Philip Nolan, who began to come to Texas in the 1790s until he ended his days pursued and shot down by the Spanish, was also collecting, trying to establish trade with the Indians, collecting horses and bringing them back to Louisiana. It really was a very wild frontier. Yes, sir, into that.
Any idea why the Louisianans pronounce his name differently for the Texans?
No, other than Texans pronounce everything differently. In New York, it's Houston. And Refugio is spelled refugio. And Manor and most of the rest of the world thinks it's manor. So yeah, it's just
nothing of Blanco.
So it's the same, but they do it even with the Indians. The Natchitoches, Louisiana, and Nacogdoches, Texas, same word for the same group of Indians. It's just a kind of a French pronunciation and the Spanish pronunciation. Yes, sir.
Why is Paseo Francesa not accessible either from Mexico or the United States?
Who?
Paseo Francesa.
Possibly.
Oh, Bastrop de Francia. I'm sorry. Again, you know, it's the whole. Bastrop de Francia was named in the 1680s. Alonso de Leon, who had been given the task of looking for La Salle and the French colony, had to cross. He was down in what is now Coahuila and Nuevo Leon, and so he had to cross the Rio Grande somewhere, and so he found a very convenient place to cross. And the purpose of that crossing was to go look for the French. Therefore, paso, which means crossing, de Francia actually literally is or not literally, but you can figuratively call it the road we took to look for the French. Right. That's essentially what it is, or the crossing to the French. And so that's where Paso de Francia comes from.
That didn't answer my question.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you very much.